The night Harriet Kendrick rode into Fort Caldwell with death chasing her horse's heels, she did not knock on the gate like a supplicant. She rode straight through it, scattering 2 startled sentries and nearly trampling the deputy who came running at the commotion, and she did not stop until her mare stood trembling at the center of the parade ground with foam lathering its neck and steam rising from its flanks into the bitter October air. "Where is he?" she demanded, swinging down before the horse had fully stopped, her boots hitting the packed dirt hard enough to send a shock up through her knees. Her black hair was loose and wild from the ride. Her coat was soaked through with creek water from a crossing she had not slowed for, and her saddlebags were clutched against her chest like a mother holding an infant. "Where is Marshal Boone? Someone tell me right now, or I swear I will walk into every building in this fort until I find him myself." The deputy, a young man named Garrett who was barely old enough to grow a proper beard, stared at her with wide, frightened eyes. He had heard of Harriet Kendrick. Everyone within 40 miles of the territory had heard of her. The herb woman who lived alone on Copper Ridge. The woman who had pulled the Dunnigan twins back from scarlet fever when the doctor in Abilene had already written them off. The woman who the Comanche medicine men reportedly traded knowledge with, which was the kind of thing that made God-fearing settlers nervous and desperately grateful in equal measure. He had heard of her, but he had never seen her, and standing before her now, soaking wet and furious in the fire-lit parade ground, she was not anything like he had imagined. "Marshal's in the sick quarters, ma'am," Garrett managed. "He's been down 3 days. Doc Heller's with him, but—" "Doc Heller," she said, and the way she said it was not unkind, but it was absolutely final, the way a person says a word when they have already discarded the thing it represents. "Take me there." Garrett took her there. She heard Silas Boone before she saw him. His breathing came through the wooden walls of the infirmary like something being dragged across gravel, labored and wet and wrong in a way that turned her stomach not with revulsion, but with urgency, the kind of urgency that sharpened everything inside her to a bright, dangerous point. She had ridden 31 miles in under 4 hours. She had crossed the Red Horse Creek at flood stage in the dark. She had done all of that for the sound coming through that wall, and she had not let herself think too carefully about why, not until this moment, not until she was here and it was real. She pushed open the door. The infirmary was a low-ceilinged room that smelled of carbolic acid and sweat, and the particular sweetness that accompanied high fever, a smell Harriet knew the way other women knew the smell of bread baking or rain coming. There were 7 cots arranged along the walls. 5 were occupied. 3 of the 5 were children, the Morrow children from the Eastern settlement. She recognized them. And 1 was Corporal Dawes, who had been sick since Tuesday, and 1 was Silas Boone. She recognized him even through the fever's ravagement. She would have recognized him anywhere, which was its own uncomfortable truth. He was a tall man, and even lying down he looked like someone built for standing. His shoulders were broad in a way that made the narrow infirmary cot look absurd beneath him, like a piece of furniture from a doll's house. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his jaw, which she knew to be the kind of jaw that conveyed authority without his having to say a word, was slack with unconsciousness. The fever had robbed him of that particular quality, that absolute, unsettling self-possession that he carried like a second skin, and seeing him without it was like seeing a great river run dry. It should not have moved her the way it did. She was a practical woman. She was not given to sentiment. She was moved anyway. "You are Miss Kendrick," said Dr. Elias Heller from the far corner, standing up from the stool where he had been sitting with his arms crossed, and his expression arranged into the particular configuration of a man who expects to be argued with. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, competent in the ordinary run of things, and completely out of his depth with this. She could see that immediately. "I did not send for you." "No," she agreed, setting her saddlebags on the nearest empty cot and beginning to unbuckle them with quick, practiced hands. "Deputy Ames sent for me. 2 days ago, apparently, though the message did not reach me until this evening because I was 40 miles north gathering juniper bark and the boy he sent did not know the ridge trails well enough to find me quickly. She glanced at the marshal, then back at her bags. What have you given him? Heller straightened. I have administered quinine for the fever and... The quinine is not working, she said, not harshly but with the directness of someone who has no time to spend on anyone's feelings. I can see that from the door. What else? Cold compresses. I've been bleeding him. She stopped what she was doing, turned and looked at the doctor with an expression that could have cut glass. You bled him. It is standard practice for killing people who might otherwise have survived, she said. Her voice did not rise. It got quieter, which was somehow worse. He's been running a fever for 3 days, doctor. He is already depleted. Every ounce of blood you took from him was an ounce of strength his body could not use to fight. She turned back to her bags. I need a pot of clean water boiled. I need the cleanest cloth you have in this room. I need you to stop bleeding anyone else in here, and I need room to work. There was a long silence. Heller was not a stupid man, and more importantly, he was not a prideful man in the deadly way that some men were. He looked at his patient, at the rattling, barely there breathing, at the skin that had gone the wrong color, and he made a decision. I'll get the water, he said. The story of how Harriet Kendrick became the herb woman of Copper Ridge was not a romantic one, and she had never told it to anyone who did not already know it, which was almost everyone. She had told pieces of it to the Comanche healer Hutsu, who had traded knowledge with her for 3 years on the understanding that knowledge was the only currency that actually mattered, and she had told a small piece of it to Deputy Ames once when he was feverish himself and had asked her where she had learned what she knew, not quite sure whether he was awake or dreaming. But the whole of it, the shape of the whole thing, she kept to herself. She had been born in 1851 in Ohio, the third of 6 children, to parents who were not cruel but who were overwhelmed in the way that poverty makes people overwhelmed, which is to say completely and constantly. Her mother had a gift with plants, not a mystical gift, not anything that could be called supernatural, but a sharp, observant intelligence that recognized pattern and property in the natural world the way a mathematician recognizes pattern in numbers. She knew which roots settled a stomach, and which leaves brought down swelling, and which bark could manage pain when there was no money for the doctor, and the doctor was 3 hours away regardless. Harriet had learned from her mother with the focused intensity of someone who understands early that knowledge is protection. By 12, she could identify 47 plants by sight and know their properties. By 15, she could compound a simple tincture and knew the difference between a fever that broke itself and one that was building toward crisis. By 18, she had read every medical text she could get her hands on, which in rural Ohio was not many, but she had read them with the thoroughness of someone memorizing scripture. Then her mother had died in the winter of 1869, of a lung infection that took her in 3 weeks, and the grief of that had driven Harriet west with a kind of purposeful fury that other people sometimes mistook for courage, but was really something closer to controlled devastation. She had come to Kansas Territory in 1871. She had bought the ridge land with money earned nursing in Missouri. She had built the cabin herself, with help from the Garrett family before their boy was old enough to be a deputy, and she had spent the next 7 years learning everything she could learn about the plants of this landscape, trading knowledge with the Comanche healers who grudgingly and then genuinely recognized her as a person who took the work seriously, and building a reputation in the surrounding settlements that was half respect and half something that made certain kinds of people uncomfortable. She was 27 years old, alone by choice, and the most knowledgeable healer within 100 miles who was not operating out of fear or superstition. She had met Silas Boone 14 months ago, in the spring of 1878. He had come to her cabin with his hat in his hands, not metaphorically, literally, standing at her door with his hat pressed against his chest, because the Morrow girl had taken a bad fall, and the family was afraid of infection in the wound. He had been sent to fetch the herb woman because Dr. Heller was attending a difficult birth across the county, and there was no one else. She had been in her drying shed when she heard the knock, and she had come to the door still holding a bundle of yarrow she had been sorting, and she had looked at him for one startled moment before she got her face arranged into its professional neutrality. He was not what she had expected a frontier marshal to look like, which was foolish of her because she should have known better than to hold expectations. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the door frame of the shed when he came closer, with dark eyes that were taking in everything around him with the unhurried attention of someone who had trained themselves to observe. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw that looked old and had healed well, and she had wondered briefly what had caused it before she told herself firmly that it was none of her business. "You are Harriet Kendrick," he said, and it was not a question. "I am," she said. "I am Marshal Silas Boone." He paused. "I expect you've heard of me." "I've heard the name," she said, which was true, and which told him nothing about what she had heard, which was also intentional. He had ridden to the Morrow farm with her, and she had cleaned and treated the girl's wound with a poultice of calendula and comfrey, and a wash of golden seal, talking to the girl quietly while she worked so the girl would not focus on the discomfort. And when she was finished, she had given the mother precise, numbered instructions that left nothing to interpretation. She had felt the marshal watching her the entire time, not in the way men sometimes watched her with the particular mixture of skepticism and resentment she had learned to recognize and ignore, but with the focused, respectful attention he might give to a skilled tracker or an excellent shot, someone whose ability he was taking seriously. He had ridden back with her to the ridge trail and then stopped his horse at the foot of it and said, "I want to thank you properly, Miss Kendrick. What you did back there was," he paused, searching for the word. "Impressive does not feel like enough of a word." "It is enough," she said. "The girl will be fine if her mother follows the instructions." "She will follow them," he said. "I'll make sure of it." She had looked at him then, this tall, self-contained man on a gray horse in the late April afternoon, and she had felt something shift in her chest that she had chosen to classify as simply nothing, because nothing was safer than what it actually was. "Good night, Marshal," she said. "Good night, Miss Kendrick," he said. Over the next 14 months he had found reasons to see her 7 times. Each time it was nominally professional, a question about the fever that was moving through the northern settlements, a request for her help with an injured prisoner who distrusted doctors, a consultation about an unidentified plant that someone's child had eaten. Each time they talked longer than the professional reason required. Each time she found herself noticing things about him that she had no practical reason to notice. The way he listened to her without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. The way he never once suggested she was doing something inappropriate by living alone and practicing her trade. The way he had said once, very matter-of-factly, "You are the most knowledgeable person about medicine that I have ever met, and I have met physicians trained in 3 cities," and then looked slightly surprised at his own candor, as if he had not entirely meant to say it aloud. She had not told him what that had meant to her. She had been somewhat afraid of what she would have said. Now she stood in the infirmary at Fort Caldwell, 7 years of frontier-built knowledge unpacked across an empty cot beside her, and she looked at Silas Boone burning alive from the inside, and she made herself calm, made herself into the instrument she had spent her life building, and she went to work. The fever had a name, though the settlers did not know it by that name. She had seen it twice before, once during her first winter in Kansas, and once 3 years ago near the Pawnee River settlements. The local people called it the fire sickness, or the long fever, or sometimes simply the bad one. What she knew of it from her own observation, and from Hutsu's teaching, was that it had a pattern. It came in 3 distinct phases, each with its own characteristics, and the critical error most practitioners made, including, apparently, Dr. Heller, was treating all 3 phases the same way, which was like trying to win 3 different battles with a single unchanged strategy. The first phase, which typically lasted 2 to 3 days, was characterized by the high fever and the respiratory involvement, the wet, labored breathing she had heard through the wall. This was the phase Silas was still in, barely, at the edge of it. The danger here was not the fever itself, but the fluid that was accumulating in the lungs, combined with the weakness from 3 days of inadequate treatment. The bloodletting had made it worse. She did not allow herself to be angry about that because anger was not useful, but she noted it with the grim precision of someone cataloging a problem they must now solve. She worked in layers. First, she prepared a steam inhalation with eucalyptus oil and dried thyme, setting the pot to simmer beside the cot, and arranging the situation so that, when he was propped on an angle, the vapor would reach his airways and begin to loosen what had settled there. Then she prepared the compound she thought of as the primary tincture, a precise combination of boneset, which she had in dried form in her bags, and which the old-timers called thoroughwort, and which was perhaps the single most effective thing she knew for this type of fever, elderflower for the secondary infection, and wild ginger for the circulation that needed to be moving properly to do its work. The ratios mattered. She measured by feel and smell and color because she had done this enough times that her hands knew what her mind confirmed, and she was not careless, but she was not slow. Heller watched her from the corner. After a while he came closer. He did not speak, but she could feel his attention shift from skeptical to curious, which she accepted as progress. "What is that?" he asked finally when she was combining the last elements of the tincture. "Eupatorium perfoliatum," she said. "Boneset. The aerial parts dried. It is remarkably effective for the kind of fever that presents with this level of respiratory involvement." She glanced at him. "There is good observational evidence for it going back to the colonial period, and the Ojibwe and several other nations have used it for generations. I have found their knowledge of this particular plant more reliable than anything in the standard texts." Heller was quiet for a moment. "I was not trained to use plant medicine." "I know," she said without judgment. "I am not criticizing your training, I am working alongside it." He nodded slowly. After another moment he said, "What can I do to help?" She looked at him directly for the first time since she had arrived. "Sit with the children, watch their breathing. If any of them show what he's showing, come get me immediately. And there is a second thing I want to prepare for the secondary phase. I will need the pine resin from the supply stores. Tell me if they have any." "I will check," he said, and went to do it. She turned to Silas Boone. Close up, the fever's work was more visible. The skin of his face was dry and hot, and flushed across the cheekbones in that particular way that always made her think of something burning down from the inside out. And his hands, she picked up one of his hands without quite deciding to. Checking the pulse at the wrist were hot and somehow unfamiliar, which was strange because she had never held his hand before. She found the pulse. Fast and shallow and not as strong as she needed it to be, but present. Definitively present. "All right," she said quietly to him and to the room and to herself. "I am here. I have what you need, just stay." She worked through the first hour without stopping, administering the tincture in careful doses against the inside of his cheek, where it could absorb even without active swallowing, adjusting the steam angle twice, changing the compresses with cool water that she had prepared herself. Not cold, because cold was a common error. Cold caused the body to shunt circulation inward and could make the fever climb rather than release. Cool was the temperature, and the compresses needed to be changed before they warmed to body temperature, which meant every 8 minutes, which meant she could not leave his side for more than a few minutes at a time. She sat beside his cot on the stool that Heller had vacated, and she worked, and the fort settled into its late-night quiet around her, and the fire in the small stove ticked and breathed, and she let herself exist in the focused, purposeful space that good work always opened in her, the space where there was no past and no future and no complicated feeling, only the next right thing to do. She was changing the third compress when he spoke. It was not coherent speech. It was fever speech, the kind that came up from whatever depth the delirium occupied and bore only tangential relation to actual thought. But she stilled immediately because even fever speech told you things if you listened right. "Not going to," he said, and stopped. His head moved against the pillow in a restless arc. "Can't let them." Another stop. Something crossed his face that looked like anguish, and she found she could not look away from it. "Harriet." He said her name as clearly as if he were wide awake, and the breath went out of her like she had been struck. "Harriet, don't." He did not finish it. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she steadied herself with the particular discipline she had built over years of work that required her to be steady when every human impulse wanted to be otherwise. And she changed the compress. And she noted his temperature with her hand against his forehead. And she determined that it had not worsened in the last hour, which was not improvement but was the beginning of the possibility of improvement. And that was what she had right now, and it would be enough. She did not let herself think about what it meant that he had said her name. By 2 in the morning, the fever had begun to move. It was subtle at first, a slight easing in the texture of his breathing, a single bead of sweat appearing at his temple, which was the thing she had been waiting for because sweating meant the body's thermoregulation was beginning to reassert itself, meant the fever was breaking rather than building. She leaned closer, watching, and when the second bead of sweat appeared, she allowed herself, for the first time since she had ridden through the gate, to take a full breath. "Come on," she said softly. By 3 in the morning, the sweat was running freely, and his temperature had dropped 2 full degrees, which she assessed by touch and by the very slight change in the color of his face, the red beginning to ease back toward something closer to normal. His breathing was not right yet. It would not be right for days, possibly, but it was looser, less like something being dragged and more like something simply laboring, which was better. Better was everything right now. She was refilling the steam pot when Heller appeared at her elbow. "The Morrow boy," he said, and she heard it in his voice before she turned around. "He is beginning to show the same signs." She went to the boy's cot immediately. He was perhaps 9 years old, with the wide-set eyes and flushed cheeks of the early first phase, and she assessed him rapidly, her hands moving through the evaluation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Pulse, skin temperature and texture, respiratory rate, the quality of the breathing. She checked the lymph nodes at his neck and found them swollen but not alarmingly so. First phase just beginning. "He has more time than the Marshal," she said. "Prepare a second set of compresses. I will compound a smaller dose of the tincture for his weight and age." "How do you know his weight?" Heller asked. "I treated him for an infected cut 2 months ago," she said, already moving back toward her supplies. "He has grown some since then, but not dramatically. I am estimating within 10 pounds. Heller stared at her for a moment with an expression she did not have time to interpret. "You remember every patient you have ever treated." "I remember enough," she said, which was close to true. "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to get the compresses?" He got the compresses. She worked through the rest of the night in a controlled rhythm, moving between the Marshal and the Morrow boy, with 2 additional checks on the Morrow daughters who were both in the second phase of the illness. Easier to manage. Their fevers already beginning to show the natural pattern of break and climb and break again that meant the body was doing its work correctly. Corporal Dawes she assessed as being past the crisis point and simply needing rest and fluids, which she communicated to Heller with specific instructions. The sky outside the infirmary's single small window began to lighten from black to deep gray at around 5 in the morning, and it was precisely at this point that Silas Boone opened his eyes. She was sitting beside his cot, adding a small amount of ginger preparation to the steam pot, when she became aware that the quality of his stillness had changed. She looked up and found him looking at her. His eyes were dark and at this moment slightly glazed with the aftermath of fever, but there was awareness behind them. Actual, genuine awareness. He was looking at her with the particular expression of someone working to understand where they are and what has happened and what they are seeing, and she watched the pieces connect behind his eyes with the kind of clarity that came after high fever broke, that crystalline, absolute clarity that was almost like being newborn. "Harriet," he said, not fever speech this time. Her actual name said with intention. "Marshal," she said. She kept her voice even. "Do not try to sit up." He did not try to sit up. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "You're here," he said, as if this were something that required confirmation. "I am here," she agreed. How long? His voice was ragged and thin, the fever's damage still present in every syllable. "I arrived approximately 4 hours ago. You have been down for 3 days. She reached for the cup she had prepared, clean water with a small amount of honey and a few drops of the secondary tincture she had prepared for the next phase, the recovery phase, where the body needed support of a different kind. "Can you swallow if I help you?" He said he could, and she helped him, supporting his head with one hand and tilting the cup with the other, and she was very focused on the practical task and not at all focused on the fact that his hair was damp under her hand, or that he was watching her face with an attention that she found genuinely difficult to hold at this proximity. He swallowed. She lowered his head back to the pillow. "You rode here," he said. Not a question. His eyes moved over her coat, still damp at the seams, her boots that were muddy from the creek crossing, her hair that she had not had an opportunity to arrange into anything sensible. "Yes," she said. "Tonight. Last night, yes. It is nearly morning now." He was quiet for a moment. She watched his chest rise and fall, counting the breaths automatically, assessing. Better, still damaged, but genuinely better. "Why?" he asked. She had known the question was coming. She had had 4 hours to prepare an answer and had not been able to settle on one that felt both honest and safe, which told her something she did not quite want to face directly. "Because Deputy Ames sent for me," she said, which was true. "He said you were 40 miles away." 31, she corrected, because precision mattered to her even when nothing else was stable. "The ridge road to the South Fork is faster than the main trail if you know it." "In the dark," he said. "My horse knows those trails." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The infirmary had gone almost entirely still, Heller dozing in his corner chair, the children's breathing quieted into sleep. Outside, the first birds of morning had begun, and the gray light in the window was becoming, very slowly, something closer to gold. "Harriet," he said again, and the way he said it this time was different from either time before, different from the fever's version, and different from the practical version. Something quieter and more deliberate. The way a person says a word they have been holding carefully for a long time and are only now allowing out. "Rest," she said. "We can talk when you are stronger. I want to say something first," he said. He stopped, and she saw something cross his face that was not residual fever, something more complicated and more chosen. "While I am certain I am going to say it and not talk myself out of it again." She did not say anything. She sat very still. "I have been looking for reasons to ride up to that ridge for over a year," he said. "Every single time I found one I told myself it was professional. A question about medicine. Concern for someone in the settlements." The ghost of something that might have been a smile moved across his exhausted face. "I'm not certain I have ever been quite that dishonest with myself before. I am generally a fairly straightforward person." She looked at her hands in her lap, then she looked up at him. "You are quite good at finding professional reasons," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been ashamed of it." "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious despite herself. "Because you deserve to be asked directly," he said. Not approached sideways like. He stopped again, and when he continued his voice was rougher, though she thought that was more the fever's damage than emotion, or perhaps both, indistinguishable. "You are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, Harriet Kendrick. I mean that in the plainest, most specific way. I do not say it to flatter you. I say it because I have never watched someone work the way I watched you work with the Morrow girl last spring, or the way I imagine you have been working in this room tonight, and felt so," he searched for the word, "so completely rearranged." She was quiet for what felt like a very long time. "You should sleep," she said finally. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I know," he said, "but "But I heard you," she said. Quietly, carefully, the way she said things when they mattered most. "I heard you, Silas. Sleep now. We will talk properly when you are not running a fever and I have not been awake for 20 hours." His eyes stayed on her face for another moment. Then he closed them, and within 3 minutes she could tell by his breathing that he was asleep. She sat beside his cot until the morning was fully gold in the window, and she let herself feel, just for those few minutes, what she had been not feeling for 14 months, the full accumulated weight of it, the warmth of it, the frightening largeness of it. She let herself feel it, and then she got up and checked on the Morrow boy, and noted his fever had dropped half a degree, and she went to tell Heller what she needed for the next stage of treatment, and she did not let herself cry, though it was a somewhat closer call than she would ever admit to anyone. The next 3 days were the most exhausting and the most quietly extraordinary that Harriet could remember in years. She did not leave the fort. This was partly practical. Her patients needed monitoring through the second phase of the illness, which was the trickiest in its own way, characterized by apparent improvement followed by a second, smaller fever spike that novice practitioners always panicked about and experienced ones new to manage carefully. And it was partly something she could not have named without using words she was still not quite ready to use. The commandant of the fort, a weathered man named Colonel Prescott, who wore his rank with the quietly exhausted dignity of someone who had been managing impossible situations for so long it had become simply his natural state, offered her a room in the officers' quarters, and she accepted, sleeping in 4-hour stretches whenever she could, eating whatever the cook brought to the infirmary door without paying much attention to what it was. Heller became, over the course of those 3 days, something she had not expected, a genuine colleague. He watched her work with increasing focus, asked questions that revealed a real desire to understand rather than simply to defend his own practice, and on the evening of the second day admitted to her that he had doubted, upon her arrival, whether she could do what she had done. "You saved his life," he said. They were sitting in the infirmary after a long session of monitoring, both of them holding tin cups of coffee that the cook had brought, both of them too tired to speak in full sentences. "I want to be honest with you about that. He would not have survived another night the way he was going." She looked at her coffee. "I was not certain he would survive the first night," she said. "I was not certain for about 2 hours." Heller nodded. "I saw you during those 2 hours," he said. "You did not show it." "Showing it does not help the patient," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it takes something from the healer." He paused. "I am sorry I was not more skilled in this. I am sorry You did what you knew," she said, cutting the apology off cleanly because she meant it. "I am not interested in blame. I am interested in better outcomes the next time." He looked at her with an expression she finally recognized as respect, the uncomplicated, professional kind that she was most comfortable receiving, and said, "You should have a proper practice, not a cabin on a ridge." A proper practice. "I am well suited to the cabin on the ridge," she said, which was also true. On the morning of the third day, Silas Boone sat up under his own power for the first time. She was in the infirmary when it happened, refilling the steam preparations, and she turned at the sound of the cot shifting and found him upright, his back against the wall, his dark eyes clear in a way they had not been since she had arrived. The residual fever color had left his face entirely. He still looked depleted. He would for another week, probably, but he looked like himself, the self she knew from those 14 months of professional encounters that had never been quite as professional as she had told herself. He looked like Silas Boone, which was both a relief and a difficulty. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "You should not be sitting up yet." "I feel considerably better than I did," he said. "That is not the same thing as being recovered," she said. "The second phase ended this morning. You need 2 more days of rest before Harriet." She stopped. He was looking at her with the directness that she associated with him most strongly, that particular quality of his attention, unhurried and complete, that had unsettled her from the first day she had met him. "I said things 3 days ago," he said, "when I was just coming around. You had been very ill," she said carefully. "I meant all of them," he said. "I want you to know that." The infirmary was empty except for them. The Morrow children had been moved to more comfortable accommodation when it became clear they were past the crisis. Corporal Dawes had been discharged yesterday afternoon. Heller was in the supply room taking inventory. The door was closed against the morning chill. She set down the steam pot. She turned to face him properly. "I know you meant them," she said. "I have known you for over a year. You do not say things you do not mean." "No," he agreed. "I do not." A pause. "And you?" She looked at him for a moment. The careful woman, the woman who had built every wall with intention and maintained them with daily discipline, stood in this infirmary in the first clean morning light and took stock of what she was holding and what it cost to keep holding it, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a ledge into air. "I rode 31 miles in the dark," she said, "through the Red Horse Creek at flood stage." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." "For a professional consultation," she said, and the slight lift in her voice at the end of it was as close to a joke as she was capable of at 6 in the morning after 3 days of too little sleep. The corner of his mouth moved. "Of course," he said. "I do not," she said more slowly, "take those trails at night in a flood for professional consultations." "No," he said softly. "I would not think you would." She picked up the steam pot again because she needed something to do with her hands. "You need to rest properly before we have any kind of real conversation," she said. "And I need to sleep for more than 4 hours." And then she stopped. "And then," he agreed, as if the unfinished sentence were a complete thought between them. She went out to speak with Heller about the morning's treatment plan, and she told herself she was calm, and she was almost entirely right. The real conversation happened 4 days later, on a late October afternoon that was cold and bright, the kind of day that felt polished. Silas had been moved from the infirmary to a more comfortable room in the officers' building, and by the 5th day, he was up and walking the length of the building and back, which Harriet monitored with the expression she used when patients did things she did not quite approve of but could not entirely argue with because they were doing them carefully. She had prepared to leave the fort that morning. Her bags were packed, her mare was rested and ready, and Colonel Prescott had thanked her with the sincere gravity of a man who understood what had been done and what it had cost her, and offered payment which she had negotiated down to a considerably smaller amount than he initially proposed because she was not unreasonable, but also was not calculating her worth in those terms. She was in the stable, checking her mare's shoes, when she heard him come in. "You are going to leave without saying goodbye," he said. He said it without accusation, simply as an observation, the way he said most things. She looked up from the horse's hoof she had been examining. He was standing in the stable doorway, still pale but upright, wearing his hat and coat in the way that meant he had made a deliberate effort, and she thought not for the first time that he was the kind of man who looked most himself when he was dressed like that, like every element of his appearance was a considered choice. "I was going to come and find you first," she said, which was true. "Were you?" he said. "Yes." She put the mare's hoof down. "She is fine," she told the horse. "Good girl." He stepped further into the stable. It was warm inside, the animal warmth of horses and hay, and the afternoon light came through the gaps in the boards in long pale strips that caught the dust in the air and made it visible. It was, she thought irrelevantly, the kind of light that painters used. "I would like to ask you something," he said, coming to stand on the other side of the mare, so there was a horse between them which struck her as both practical and somewhat symbolic. "Ask," she said. "I would like to come and see you," he said. "Not with a professional reason, without any pretense of a professional reason." A pause. "I would like to come and talk to you and learn from you, and I would like to spend time with you, Harriet, with the full understanding that I am asking something of you that requires trust, and that I am aware trust is something you have built your life around protecting." She looked at him over her horse's back for a long moment. "You are better with words than I expected," she said. "I have had 5 days to think about what I wanted to say," he said. "That is fair," she said. She stroked the mare's neck absently. "I do not," she stopped, started again. "I value my life on the ridge. I value my independence. I am not another stop." I have seen what happens to women who make the wrong choice in that area. The consequences fall on them, not on the man. I know, he said, and the way he said it was not the automatic agreement of someone who didn't really understand. It was the acknowledgement of someone who had observed the same reality she was describing and had drawn the same conclusions. I am telling you that it is not a small thing, she said. What you are asking. I know it is not, he said. I am not asking for something small. She looked at him. He looked back, steady and quiet, not pressing, not filling the silence with persuasion. Just waiting, because he was, fundamentally, a man who understood that some answers needed space. All right, she said finally. All right, he said. Come to the ridge, she said. On a day when you do not have a professional reason. Come and have supper. We will see how we get on without a professional reason. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not triumph. She would have disliked triumph, but something quieter, something more like the careful receiving of something precious. Thank you, he said. Do not thank me yet, she said, with the slight severity that she knew he had somehow figured out was the way she expressed affection, which was itself alarming in its own particular way. You have not had supper on the ridge yet. Is the food that bad? He asked. The food is excellent, she said. It is everything else about the situation that you should perhaps think carefully about. He smiled then fully, and she had seen him smile before, but not like that, not relaxed and genuine and directed entirely at her, and she turned back to the mare's girth straps because she needed a moment. I'll see you next week, he said. Next week, she agreed. He came the following Saturday, early enough in the afternoon that she knew he had started before dawn to make the ride reasonable, and he arrived at the Ridge cabin with a bottle of rye whiskey that he had thought to bring, and a formal hat that he had thought better of and left behind. And she met him at the door of the cabin and showed him in without ceremony and put him to work immediately peeling vegetables for supper, because she had found that people revealed themselves most honestly when they were given a task and observed in the doing of it. He peeled vegetables with the same methodical competence he applied to everything, and he asked her about the jars and bundles and drying racks that occupied every available surface of the cabin, and she found herself talking about her work the way she rarely talked about it to anyone, not explaining or defending it, just describing it, the daily logic of it, the patterns that she tracked through seasons and years, the language of the natural world that she had been teaching herself for as long as she could remember. He listened the way he did, complete and unhurried, and once, just once, he put down the potato he was holding and said, "Wait, say that again. What you said about the difference between the first and second phase of the long fever, say it again slowly." She said it again. He was quiet for a moment. "You worked that out yourself," he said, "from observation." "Partly," she said, "partly from Hutsu, partly from texts when I could find them." "That is Harriet, that is the kind of knowledge that people write papers about," he said. "Medical papers, journals." She laughed, which she did not often do, a short, surprised sound. "I do not think the medical journals are particularly interested in the observations of a woman with no formal training, living on a Kansas ridge." "They should be," he said, with a flatness that told her he meant it absolutely. She looked at him. The late afternoon light was doing the same thing in her cabin that it had done in the stable, finding the angles, making the ordinary visible. He was sitting at her table in his shirt sleeves with a half-peeled potato in one hand and an expression of genuine outrage on her behalf, and she thought, standing at her own hearth in her own cabin that she had built with her own hands, that she had never felt so completely seen. "Perhaps someday," she said, which was as close as she could come in that moment to saying something she had no words yet for. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the third visit they had established a natural rhythm that surprised her with how unforced it felt, how undemanding, the way good work settled into a comfortable repetition that was nonetheless never boring because each iteration brought something new. He told her things about his work, the particular loneliness of it, the The weight of being the person who had to hold the line between order and chaos in a landscape where that line was never very stable, with the same plainness with which she told him things about hers. He had been a lawman for 8 years, since he was 24. He had grown up in Missouri, youngest of 3, and had come west after the war as so many men had, carrying the particular scars that that period left on every soul who had lived through it on either side. He did not speak of the war in detail, and she did not press him, but she noted the ways it had shaped him, the self-containment, the vigilance, the deep weariness that never quite left his eyes, and she received that knowledge with the same careful respect with which she received any knowledge of something living. He was 32. She was 27. Neither of them was young in any sense that the word usually implied, and they both found this, she thought, quietly reassuring. By the 6th visit in December, with the first snow of the season coming down outside the cabin in soft, purposeful sweeps, she let him stay for supper and the full evening, and they sat by the fire afterward talking about nothing essential, a book she had been reading, a case he had been working, a particular quality of the winter sky that they had both noticed independently. And at some point she realized that she was sitting with her shoulder against his arm, entirely naturally, without having planned or decided it, and that he had, with equal naturalism, turned slightly toward her so that her comfort was maintained. She did not move away. He did not either. When he stood to leave, it was late past 9, and the snow had stopped and the stars were extraordinary. He took his coat from the hook by the door and stood for a moment with his hand on the latch. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You said that last time," she said, "before you asked to come to the ridge." "I keep having things to ask you," he said, which was the most Silas Boone sentence she had ever heard him say. "Ask," she said. He turned from the door. The firelight caught him sideways, and she thought again, as she always thought in these moments, that he was the kind of person who was very easy to look at, not because his features were particularly regular, but because everything in his face was honest, and honesty had a particular quality of light. "May I kiss you?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the cold pressed against the walls of the cabin. The fire breathed behind her. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room in 2 steps and kissed her with the same quality that characterized everything else. He did deliberate and complete, and not hurried, as if this were something worth taking the time to do properly. Her hands came up and held the lapels of his coat, not pulling him closer, just holding, as if she needed something solid to anchor her while everything inside her rearranged itself. When it ended, they stood with their foreheads together for a moment. "I am," he said, very quietly, "deeply in love with you," she breathed. "I know," she said. "I have been for some time as well." He pulled back enough to look at her. "You did not say so. You did not ask," she said. "Directly, I mean. You asked to come to the ridge. You asked to kiss me. You did not ask." "I am asking now," he said. She looked up at him. The woman who had built every wall with intention, who had come to this ridge with her grief and her knowledge and her fierce, unbreakable independence, who had learned to need nothing that she could not provide for herself, looked at this man in her fire-lit cabin in the first December snow and felt the walls not fall but simply, quietly become unnecessary. "Yes," she said. "It is mutual, completely." He kissed her again briefly, with something that felt like relief as much as tenderness. And then he put his coat on and went out into the clear, cold night, and she stood in the doorway and watched his lantern until it disappeared around the first bend of the ridge trail. And then she went inside and stood at her fire for a long time, feeling the full, unprecedented strangeness and rightness of being this happy. The winter deepened, and they wrote letters when the distance between visits stretched too long, a practice Harriet had not expected from him, and which revealed a quality she found entirely charming. He wrote the way he spoke, plainly and directly, without ornamentation, but his plainness had a precision to it that made every sentence exactly what it needed to be. She kept the letters in the cedar box on the shelf above her work table and did not think too carefully about what this said about her. She visited the fort twice during January and February, once to consult on a birth that was proving difficult, and once when a late winter sickness moved through the children's population of the nearby settlement. And both times she and Silas found evenings to spend together in the officers' dining room over coffee and the ongoing conversation they had been having since October, which was really just one very long conversation that paused and resumed and picked up exactly where it had been left. The way good conversations always do. In early March, he rode up to the ridge on a Tuesday, which was not their usual day, and she knew from the way he hitched his horse too quickly, not the usual careful process, that something had happened. She met him at the door. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. "Something I should have told you earlier." He paused. "May I come in?" "Of course," she said, stepping back. He came in and stood in the middle of her cabin, still in his coat, hat in his hands. She had seen this posture before, the first day he had come to her door over a year ago. It did not frighten her. Whatever he needed to say, she was prepared to hear it. "When I came west," he said, "after the war, I was not entirely," he stopped and started differently. "I was briefly married before I took the marshal's position, before I came to this territory." She was still but not tense. She waited. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She died in the influenza outbreak of 1872. We had been married 11 months. He looked at the hat in his hands. "I do not tell you this to another stop. I tell you because you should know it. Because you should know everything that is relevant to," he gestured, slightly, at the space between them, which encompassed everything. She looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed the room and took his hat out of his hands and set it on the hook by the door, and then she came back and put her hand on his arm. "I am sorry," she said. "About Clara," he nodded. "And I am glad you told me," she said, "though it does not change anything." He looked at her. "No, no," she said. "You are who you are in part because of everything that has happened to you. That is true for both of us." She paused. "I think perhaps you were afraid I would see it," as she tilted her head. "A trap, a hidden complication. Something like that," he said. "It is not," she said. "It is your past. I have one as well. We are both the people our histories made us, and I think the people our histories made us are quite well suited to each other." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that still caught her off guard sometimes, the full weight of his attention, and then he said, "I would like to ask you something." She almost laughed. "You are always asking me something." "This is the last thing," he said. "Or rather, it is the beginning of everything." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, simple and silver, with a small garnet set into it, and held it in his palm. "Harriet Kendrick," he said, with the directness that was simply the way he was, "I would like to marry you. If you will have me." She looked at the ring, then at him. She thought about the woman she had been when she came to this ridge 7 years ago, carrying her grief like a stone, building her independence like armor, absolutely certain that she needed nothing that the world might offer in the way of partnership, because the world's offers in that area had mostly been insufficient or conditional or structured in ways that required her to be smaller than she was. She thought about what this man had done in 14 months and 3 visits, and all the letters in the cedar box. He had not once, in any of her memory of him, made her feel that her knowledge or her capability or her independence was anything other than the specific and remarkable thing he loved about her. He had said as much, in various ways, and she had believed him because she had learned to read people with the same attention she brought to everything, and everything in him told the same honest story. She picked the ring from his palm. "Yes," she said, "but I keep the ridge." He blinked. Then he smiled, the full genuine smile that she was still slightly undone by, and said, "Of course you keep the ridge." "And I keep my practice," she said, "which will expand. Heller and I have been discussing a proper arrangement for consultation." "I would expect nothing else," he said, "and I will not." She stopped. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I think you know that." "Harriet," he said, with a patience that somehow managed to be warm rather than condescending, "I know exactly who you are. I am asking to marry exactly who you are. There is no version of this in which you become someone else." She put the ring on her own finger because she was entirely capable of doing that herself, and then she looked up at him and said, "Then yes. Completely and entirely yes." He kissed her and then held her, and she let him, her face against his chest, listening to his heart that had come so close to stopping in October and was now beating with the solid, reliable rhythm of something very much alive. They were married in April 1879, on a day that was almost aggressively beautiful, the kind of spring day that seemed designed specifically for the occasion, with the ridge greening around the cabin and the sky performing an almost theatrical blue. The ceremony was conducted by the circuit preacher who came through the territory every 6 weeks, a pragmatic man named Reverend Cole, who had married enough frontier couples to have shed any illusions about romantic idealism, and had arrived at something better, which was a deep and practical appreciation for two people choosing each other deliberately. Harriet wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that she had bought in Abilene the previous winter for no reason she had acknowledged to herself at the time. Her hair was up, and she had allowed one of the Morrow girls, now fully recovered and deeply attached to the woman who had saved her brother, to put small white flowers in it. Silas wore his good coat and his best boots and the expression of someone who cannot quite believe his luck, but is choosing to accept it with both hands. Colonel Prescott and half the officers of Fort Caldwell attended. Heller attended and shook her hand with a warmth that she appreciated. Deputy Ames attended and cried openly, which he would later strenuously deny. Hootsu, the Comanche healer, did not attend. That was not the nature of their relationship, but sent a gift of a beautifully prepared medicine bundle and a message in the language they had built between them that roughly translated to, "It is good to have an ally who is also happy." She thought it was good, too. They settled into a life that was genuinely their own invention, which was the only kind of life that either of them could have managed. She kept the ridge cabin as her working space, her drying sheds, her workroom, her library of notes and texts she had accumulated over years. And they built, over the following summer, an addition to the fort-adjacent house that Silas occupied as marshal, a proper consultation room where she could see patients who came to her from the town that was growing up around the fort, and a laboratory, for want of a better word, where she could work on the formulations she was developing with Heller, who had become something close to a genuine collaborator. The collaboration with Heller grew into something neither of them had anticipated. He was writing up a paper on the treatment of the long fever, what she knew they would begin to call typhoid in the years ahead, as the medical understanding caught up with the observation, and he asked her, with some awkwardness that she respected him for working through, whether she would co-author it. "My name on a medical paper will not help its reception," she said practically. "I know," he said. "I intend to put it there anyway." She looked at him. "Then yes," she said. The paper was submitted to a St. Louis medical journal in the fall of 1879. Whether it was published was, as she predicted, complicated, but the knowledge it represented was already being shared through the more informal networks of frontier medicine, through the conversations of healers and the letters of practitioners, and the word of mouth that in the territories was often more effective than any journal. Silas read every draft. He made no suggestions about the medical content, because he knew the boundaries of his knowledge precisely, which was itself a form of intelligence she admired. But he caught 3 grammatical errors and 1 logical inconsistency in her argument structure, and handed the manuscript back with them marked, and she had stared at the logical inconsistency for a long moment and then fixed it and thanked him without looking at him because she was slightly embarrassed at having missed it. "You did not have to be embarrassed," he said. "I know," she said. "Everyone misses things," he said. "I know," she said again, and she did intellectually, and she was working on it. In the spring of 1880, she realized she was pregnant. She told Silas on a Sunday morning very directly because she was incapable of any other mode, and his response was to sit down quite suddenly on the nearest chair and look at her with an expression that she catalogued as profoundly moved, slightly overwhelmed, and completely unable to assemble a sentence. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am," he stopped. "Yes, Harriet, I am." Another stop. "I do not have words for this." "That is unusual for you," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Then he stood up and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, which was not the right sentence and was also entirely the right sentence. Their son was born in November 1880. They named him Thomas, after her grandfather, who had been the first person she had ever met who treated her intelligence as a natural and valuable thing rather than a complication to be managed. Thomas arrived with the dark hair of his father and the sharp, observant eyes of his mother, and Harriet, who had not allowed herself to think too specifically about what motherhood would feel like, was surprised and slightly undone by the particular ferocity of what she felt the first time she held him. She was back at her workbench 10 days later, adjusting for the reality of a child underfoot, which she did with the same systematic pragmatism she applied to everything. Silas managed the adaptation to fatherhood with the same quality of deliberate, attentive competence he brought to every challenge, and the only time she saw him genuinely lost was during the first night that Thomas was sick with a common cold, when he came to her with an expression of barely controlled anxiety and said, "Tell me exactly what to do," and she almost said something gentle, and instead handed him the prepared steam cloth and the exact instructions, and watched him follow them to the letter, and thought that this was perhaps the thing she loved most about him, that he was never too proud to be told what to do by the person who knew. The years settled into their particular shape. Fort Caldwell grew. The town around it, it was calling itself Caldwell Crossing by 1881, grew. More settlers came. More sickness came with them, as it always did, the diseases of proximity and poverty and the frontier's particular indifference to human fragility. Harriet's practice grew in proportion, and she grew in proportion to her practice, her knowledge deepening and widening with each case, each season's new challenge. She rode out to the Comanche camps twice more over the following years in consultation with Hootsu, and these were encounters she held privately, not secret from Silas, who knew, but private, belonging to that part of her life that was hers alone in the way that all people need some private territory. Hootsu asked once, with the directness of long acquaintance, whether the marriage had diminished her. "No," she said. Hootsu looked at her steadily. "You are certain?" "Yes," she said. "He is the one person I have met who would actually be disappointed if I became smaller." She thought about how to say the next part. "He sees what I am and calls it good. That is—" She paused. "That is quite a thing." Hootsu nodded slowly. "Yes," she agreed. "That is quite a thing." In the fall of 1882, Thomas was almost 2 and beginning to demonstrate, with some urgency, that he had inherited his mother's relentless drive to understand everything he encountered, and Harriet was teaching him the names of plants in the way her mother had taught her, holding the leaves up and saying the words, watching him repeat them back with a seriousness that was already entirely his own. Silas would sit in the doorway of the drying shed and watch these sessions with an expression that she had learned to recognize as his particular form of happiness, contained, attentive, complete. "He is going to know more about medicine than I do before he is 12, he said once. "Probably," she agreed. "His poor teachers," Silas said, without any actual concern, and she laughed. She discovered she was pregnant again in the winter of 1882 and told Silas again on a Sunday morning, and this time his response was immediate. He crossed the room and kissed her, straightforwardly and warmly, and then said, "Are you all right? How are you feeling?" "Practical," she said. "As I generally do." "Good," he said. "That is what I would expect from you." Their second child was born in August 1883, a girl they named Margaret, for Silas's mother, who had died before he came west, and who he had described to Harriet once in enough detail that she felt she could have recognized the woman from a portrait. A woman of considerable strength and intelligence who had raised 3 children under circumstances that were not kind, and had done it with what Silas called a complete absence of self-pity, which Harriet found she admired enormously. Margaret arrived with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady eyes, and from very early on, the quality of being entirely unimpressed by anything she had not personally evaluated, which Harriet recognized with a feeling somewhere between amusement and deep familiarity. The fort held a small celebration, because the marshal was well liked in the way that people who do their job honestly and without cruelty tend to be liked, and because Harriet had saved enough people in that community that her happiness was genuinely celebrated. Colonel Prescott, grayer and more worn than he had been 4 years ago, but still carrying his rank with that dignified exhaustion, came to the house himself and brought a bottle of wine that he had apparently been saving for something, and had decided this was it. Deputy Garrett, the wide-eyed boy who had brought her to the infirmary on the night she rode in, was now less of a boy and more of a capable young man, and he sat in the corner of the celebration with the particular pride of someone who had been present at an important beginning and knew it. Silas stood beside Harriet through the whole evening with their daughter in his arms, and she watched him talk with his colleagues and his community, and hold the baby with the natural ease of a man who had spent the past 3 years learning what it was to be a father. And she thought, as she had thought many times in the preceding years, that she had been right to let the walls become unnecessary, that the specific and remarkable person she had built herself into had found in this marriage not a limitation but a complement, that she was not less herself because she loved him. She was, if anything, more. When the guests were gone and Thomas was asleep in his room and Margaret was in her cradle, Harriet stood at the window of their house and looked out at the dark October sky. It was October again, almost exactly 4 years since she had ridden through the fort gates with foam on her horse's flanks and death chasing her heels, and felt the full weight of the years and what they had made. Silas came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He was one of the few people who asked her that and actually wanted to know. She thought about how to answer. "I am thinking about the night I rode in," she said. "4 years ago October." He was quiet for a moment. "I owe you my life," he said. He had said it before, matter-of-factly, without melodrama, and each time she had deflected it as professionally as she could. This time she did not deflect. "Yes," she said, and she paused. "I think perhaps you saved mine as well in a different way." He looked at her. "How?" She turned from the window. "I was very good at being alone," she said. "I had made a kind of self-sufficiency that was genuine and necessary," and she searched. Sealed. "I do not think I had let myself want anything in a very long time. I had told myself I did not need to." She met his eyes. "You were the first person who made me think that wanting something was not the same as being vulnerable to losing myself." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I know what that cost you to say," he said finally. "I know you do," she said, "which is one of the reasons I could say it to you." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood at the window together and looked out at the cold, clear night. And the stars over the territory were the same stars they always were, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. The same stars she had ridden under 4 years ago on the night that had changed everything, not knowing it would, not knowing anything except that there was a man in that fort who was dying, and that she had what was needed to save him, and that some force in her that was larger than professional obligation had put her on that horse and sent her through the dark. She knew now what that force had been. She had known for some time. Thomas stirred in his room and called out in his sleep, the sounds of a 2-year-old navigating whatever landscape occupied his dreams, and she was already moving toward his door before the thought was fully formed, the automatic attentiveness of a mother and a healer combined, which in her case were not entirely separate things. Silas caught her hand as she passed and held it for a moment. She squeezed his fingers without stopping and went to her son, and the house breathed around her with the particular warmth of something full, something that had arrived at exactly what it was meant to be. By 1885, Harriet Kendrick. She had kept her name alongside his. Harriet Kendrick Boone in professional documents and Harriet Kendrick in her own mind, because she had built that name and it belonged to her, had trained 2 younger women in the territory in the elements of botanical medicine that she had codified over a decade of careful practice. One of them, a sharp-minded woman named Dovey, who had come west from Georgia, and had the particular hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was the only real currency that was never inflated, had proved herself capable and more, and Harriet supervised her practice with the same rigorous care with which she supervised anything. The consultation room that she and Heller had built between them was now seeing 30 patients a month, more than Dr. Heller alone had ever managed, and the treatments they developed together had reduced the fever mortality in the surrounding settlements from a figure that had been grim in 1879 to one that was, while still never comfortable, genuinely better. She tracked these numbers in a ledger that she kept with the same precision as her plant records, because the numbers meant lives, and lives were what she was for. Silas was made senior marshal of the territory in 1884, which meant more responsibility and a great deal more paper, which she helped him with when he asked and left him to manage when he did not, and which mostly meant that he was occasionally in a mood that could most accurately be described as grimly determined, which she had learned to address with coffee and the suggestion of a ride, in that order. He had not yet left her waiting for anything she had asked of him. She had kept a private tally. She thought this was perhaps an eccentricity, but she kept it anyway. Their life together was not without its difficulties. The territory was not a peaceful place, not entirely, not yet, and the work of maintaining law in a landscape that was still resolving its own fundamental questions about order and justice took things from him that she could see but not always address. There were nights when he came home with the look of a man who has seen something he cannot unsee, and she learned, as she had learned with patience, the difference between when silence was what was needed and when words were, and she offered whichever one the moment asked for. There were, in equal measure, evenings of extraordinary ordinary happiness, suppers that lasted 2 hours because the conversation refused to end. Walks along the ridge trails in the early morning when the light was doing its particular thing, and the children ran ahead investigating every rock and root with the focused enthusiasm of the very young. Nights when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, and she sat at her worktable with him at the other end of it, each of them occupied with their own work, the silence between them the kind that is not empty but full, the kind that can only exist between people who have truly learned each other. She had learned him as she had learned everything she loved, thoroughly, patiently, with the conviction that understanding was its own form of devotion. He had learned her the same way. She saw it in the 1,000 small attentions that accumulated over years into something larger than any single gesture. The way he had stocked the new consultation room with the specific supplies she had told him she needed before she had remembered to order them herself, without mentioning that he had done so until she found them there. The way he had ridden out to the northern settlement in February of 1882, specifically, to tell the settlers there that the herb woman's instructions were to be followed precisely and without modification, because someone had told him that some of them were adapting her treatments in ways that could cause harm, and he had gone and said, in his flat and completely convincing way, that her knowledge was not to be diluted by the well-meaning modifications of people who did not have her training. She had not asked him to do this. He had done it because it was right and because he understood what was at stake. Thomas was 7 in 1887, the year that a second wave of the long fever moved through the territory, and Harriet worked the hardest she had ever worked, riding between settlements and managing her consultation room and supervising Dovey's cases and maintaining the correspondence with Heller, who had retired from his fort position but remained engaged in the work they had built together. She did not get sick herself, which she attributed partly to her own preparations. She had developed what she thought of as a prevention protocol, a specific combination of preparations she took daily during fever seasons, and partly to the simple fact that she had survived a version of this illness herself in her first Kansas winter and carried some immunity she could not fully explain. Silas worried visibly throughout this period, and she let him worry because she understood that it was his form of love expressed in the only register available during a crisis. And she came home each night and told him what she knew and what she did not know and what she was planning for the next day, because she had found that this was what he needed: information, not reassurance. He was not a man who was comforted by being told not to worry. He was comforted by being trusted with the actual truth. Not a single patient under her direct care died in that second wave. She wrote this down in her ledger without flourish, simply as a number, but she allowed herself one evening of sitting by the fire with her hands in her lap feeling the full weight of it, and Silas sat across from her and did not say anything and did not need to. Their third child came in 1889, another boy they named William. And by this time they had been married 10 years, and the family had its own established rhythms, and Thomas, at 9, was already helping his mother in the drying shed, with the focused seriousness of a boy who understood that what his mother did mattered. And Margaret, at 6, was the most observant person in any room she entered, which was saying something in this family. William arrived loud and certain of himself, which both his parents found somewhat hilarious after the contained intensity of their older two, and Silas held this new son with the expression of a man whose capacity for this particular feeling has surprised him 3 times now and continues to find new depth. "He is going to be trouble," Harriet said, looking at her youngest with professional assessment. "He is going to be magnificent trouble," Silas corrected. "There is a difference." She looked at him. "Is that a distinction you have made on your own behalf?" "Possibly," he said. She laughed, and he looked at her with the expression that she had never entirely gotten accustomed to, the one that said, plainly and without any self-consciousness at all, that she was everything, and she thought, as she had thought 1,000 times. How extraordinary that the night she had ridden into a fort to save a man's life had turned out to be the night her own life fully began. The fever had come in October of 1878 and swept through the fort with the particular efficiency of illness in crowded spaces, taking down the children first and then the adults. And Harriet Kendrick had ridden 31 miles in the dark through flood-stage water to push back the dark at a dying man's side. She had done it with willow bark and eucalyptus and boneset and comfrey and cool water and 7 years of rigorously accumulated knowledge. And she had done it, if she was being completely honest, because something larger than professional obligation had been pulling at her for 14 months, and she had finally run out of road to run from it. Silas Boone had lived. More than lived, had woken up in a way that was larger than simply recovering from fever, had looked at the woman sitting beside his cot in the early morning light, and said the true things he had been talking himself out of saying for over a year, and had not regretted a single word. They were 51 miles apart on the night she rode to him. They had not been apart by more than a few days since. This was, Harriet thought, on a morning in the spring of 1891, watching her children in the kitchen and her husband at the table with his reports, and the light coming through the windows in that particular way that the spring light had, entirely correct. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. She had built her independence and her knowledge and her capability with precision and discipline, and she had used every bit of it, not despite her love but alongside it, not diminished by her choice but expanded, the way fire is expanded by good fuel, burning hotter and more completely. She put the kettle on and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the territory that had made her who she was, the wide and unruly land that had taken so much and given back so much, and was still, after 20 years, making its own terms with the people who had come to live on it. Silas came and stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his chin resting briefly on the top of her head. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She put her hand over his. "That I am grateful," she said, "for all of it, the hard parts and the good parts and all the parts in between. Even the 31 miles in the dark," he said. "Especially those," she said. "They brought me to you." He pressed a kiss to her hair. The children erupted into some argument or enthusiasm in the kitchen. Thomas's voice, firm and patient, and Margaret's, precise and slightly imperious, and William's, simply loud, and they both listened for a moment, and Harriet felt the full extraordinary ordinary weight of it. This family, this life, this house that smelled of coffee and dried herbs and the particular beloved scent of people who live closely together and know each other thoroughly. "We should go referee," she said. "Probably," he agreed, but he did not move for another moment. Neither did she. The light was very good this morning. The territory spread out beyond the window in every direction, wild and particular and full of everything, and the kettle began to sing on the stove, and from down the hall came the three separate and distinctive voices of their children making the comfortable noise of a household that was fully, irreversibly, beautifully alive. She turned from the window and went to make the coffee, and he followed her into the kitchen, and the day began in the way that good days begin, with warmth and light, and the people you have chosen all around you, and nothing left undone or unsaid that needed to be done or said, every thread resolved, every distance closed, every ride through the dark arrived at last where it was always going.